fell into that pond there. Face first. You ever been in love, Spider-Man?
This line might feel like nothing but a minuscule moment in the overall scheme of things, but it proved itself to retrospectively be a spiritual turning point in my perception of Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Now, I just want to say real quick, if you want someone to go into the itsy bitsy details of this game as a game, whether that be the technological advancements in the gameplay between Spider-Man to Miles Morales to Spider-Man 2, then you're in the wrong place because that's really not what this is. I am not going to sit here and talk as if I even know where to begin in terms of analysing a video game as a video game. This isn't a game review in the way that you typically expect to see. This is more focused on the emotional impact, or lack thereof for me, and other aspects within said game. But first, some background. When the first game was released in September of 2018, it was immediately met with an onslaught of rightly earned praise. It featured a stunning story with a fresh take on the Spider-Man mythos that seemingly nailed everything it touched. It had the perfect Peter Parker, it had the perfect balance between villains that ensured they all received the right amount of spotlight. Nothing here was undercooked in any way, shape or form. Marvel's Spider-Man was, and still is, the perfect Spider-Man story. Never before has a game even begun to come close to making me feel the same levels of sadness and elation that this game did. I mean, it had everything, from the little mannerisms in Yuri Lowenthal's performance that brought a whole new life to Peter Parker as a character, to the foundations of a larger universe that were very quickly and very neatly put in place. Spider-Man Miles Morales was the next game to release, debuting in November of 2020, and doing what was, in my eyes, more than enough to hold itself up to the standards of the first installment, featuring a smaller yet just as impactful story with Miles Morales as its protagonist, setting him up to be his own hero as opposed to being a simple second fiddle to Peter Parker. Please remember I said this, as it's going to become very, very relevant going forward and when I'm talking about Spider-Man 2. I love this game. For me, it surpasses a lot of what the first game does. It's filled to the brim with heart and that typically fundamental human element present in every Spider-Man story. Miles' arc felt fleshed out and thorough, pushing him to his limit, and man, it's just everything. With two top-tier entries under the belt, the world's attention was soon drawn to the 2023 sequel that looked to see both Spider-Men combine as playable protagonists. This was big, this game had a monumental hill to climb to even come close to matching the expectations, and with all the factors around it, it was definitely going to be a challenge, but did it succeed? Well, I loved Spider-Man. I adored Spider-Man Miles Morales, but as of right now, I'm not entirely sure I fully love Marvel's Spider-Man 2. So let's talk about it. Since I finished this game months ago, I've tried to both contextualise and open my perspective and feelings towards Spider-Man 2. From watching deep dives into the game to reading online reviews and critiques, and the sad truth is that no matter how hard I've tried, there's just something that isn't clicking. There are numerous faults that I could look to try and rationalise where this feeling of disappointment comes from. Because where I felt the first two entries into the Insomniac universe were solid, watertight and self-contained stories, I'd struggled to make that same case for Spider-Man 2. This thing, while being branded with a number 2, is the third game in this continuity, and I feel a lot of the same mixed emotions here as I do with another third installment of a Spider-Man universe with 2007's Spider-Man 3. To those who have watched Media 13 since December of 2021, you'll know that I'm on record as someone who loves Spider-Man 3, which at first may admittedly make this comparison through criticism seem a little unjust or contradictory. To that I want to be open and say that yes, I love the movie, but that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the flaws that come with it. It does suffer from an incredibly rushed story, and this does result in characters often not feeling as fleshed out as they could be. They're crammed with far too much, and it leaves very little breathing room for what made the Raimi movies so special in the first place. Where it wins me back every single time is that heart, that little bit of Spider-Man magic, and that is no different with Insomniac's third game. This story feels incredibly rushed, without space to naturally develop anything, and it often leaves certain characters to the wayside. As a result of this, it almost feels as though it's lost a lot of the emotional strength that made the previous installments so special in the first place. If the first two games were comparable to the masterpiece that is the Raimi trilogy, then this is for sure the Marvel Cinematic Universe equivalent. You know, every so often there's an ounce of magic and a trace of craft, but more often than not, it's bloated. The stuff that had the potential to work so well is consumed by the seemingly endless desire for some blockbuster spectacle. I look at the finale of the previous two games. Each of them has weight. They have this feeling of prestige, gravitas to the consequences that come as a result of our actions. As I played through those moments, I felt every single impact as if I was in their shoes because of how invested I was able to become. This is because no matter how big the battle became, it always felt as though the characters were the main focal point and everything around them just faded into the background as a result of this. Spider-Man 2 feels like it's opting for a different approach, and almost feels as though Insomniac were inclined to up the ante as if that's what we wanted, when all we really needed was more of that magic they'd done so well to conjure up 2 times before. I'm not saying the game is without its stakes entirely. You know, the ending does set up a lot for the future of this world and the characters, and I am sure that in time, the consequences from this finale will be felt. But right now, I genuinely feel defeated in my attempts to truly invest myself into a lot of the emotion within the game. As I watched Peter mourn the loss of his best friend, something was missing inside of me, something I'd felt countless times during the previous games, particularly in each final battle, and I have to admit that I think this is a result of the general pacing of the story. I can't think of a single moment that gets ample time to breathe past the introduction of the symbiote, and that's a major issue given how early in the story it's introduced. You know, if I'm going to be fair though, I have to be honest, I don't hate every single example of spectacle in Spider-Man 2, there are elements here that I like. While there was a definite lack of something within me as I was playing, I can't deny that there are select moments or visuals in the game that impressed me. There were moments that made me feel as though the game was reaching that quality I so desperately wanted it to be. For a while, it was these moments that kept me going, what gave me my fix of dopamine to the skull, because otherwise this thing was severely lacking in its supply. Throughout the game, Peter is crushed by the strain of several relationships, with himself and Harry, with MJ, with Connors, and an emerging foe in Craven, and eventually the conflict with Venom, and that's in a singular game. As crazy as it sounds, this could have actually worked because they did this in the first one, but it creates such a disorganised imbalance when Miles, as a co-protagonist, isn't given nearly the same level of depth. One would argue maybe that this inevitably balances out with the fact that his lack of content within the game's main story means that his overall arc in coming to terms with Martin Lee after battling against the hatred he'd felt for so long ultimately feels like the most well-developed aspect of the story. I mean that too, Miles genuinely has some of the best stuff in this game, as little as there might be. His relationship with Lee, as well as his family and friends, are given so much time to breathe on his side of things, as opposed to Peter, who's thrown through so many arcs at breakneck speed. Miles deserves more, for sure, but I can't deny that as counterproductive as it feels, I prefer that his lack of content means that the content in question feels fleshed out with an ounce of care, as opposed to what the other Spider-Man went through. I also want to drop a quick side note here and say that, unpopular opinion, I know, I like his final suit. Not the narrative specific one, but there is a specific style that you can unlock with it, and I couldn't get enough of it. That very much became the main suit that I was using for Miles throughout. This story lacks a whole lot of humanity on Peter's side. For someone who is literally one of my favourite characters ever, I had a surprising lack of empathy and feelings towards a lot of moments in his story, and it was Miles who left this game as the shining star. That, you know, this isn't me crying about the fact that Miles is written with more care than Peter, because as contradictory as it sounds, in terms of content, it almost feels as though they were going the opposite direction with it and it just completely backfired. It almost feels as though they wanted Peter to be the one who would take all the plaudits, but it's that very overindulgence that leads to a more natural progression with Miles and his narrative. The unforgiving pace of this game's story doesn't flow nearly as well as it has done previously. I remember 2018's story picking things up considerably in the final act, and yet it still doesn't feel anywhere near as bloated and rushed as this. Spider-Man 2 lacks something fundamental in its writing, something so small, and it's that dash of humanity that was the heart and soul of the first two games. That's a sentence that applies mostly to Peter because I don't think Miles necessarily falls into this line of criticism. It also doesn't apply to the side content because if I'm being totally honest, that did more for me than Peter's story, and I'm so damn serious about that. The side content in Marvel's Spider-Man 2 was part of what ultimately saved this game for me, reminding me of why I was excited for this thing in the first place. I don't want to get confused and have people thinking that this is a hit piece and I'm about to go all Mr. Negative for the full video, because fuck that, man. I love Spider-Man. And anything I've said until this point is purely from a place of disappointment, not hate. With that in mind, I will let you know here that this is where my full opinion on matters gets a little muddy, because it might feel like I'm about to start contradicting some things I've said until now. So, let's try and get into why this game ultimately ended up being redeemed for me.
Oh, hey, Spider-Man.
Hey, sorry. Friend of mine.
Take all the time you need. If it helps, it looked like he was at peace.
He was. He's finally on that adventure with his wife.
Firstly, and I know I've mentioned it briefly before, but man, I gotta highlight this again. This right here, this dynamic between Martin Lee and Miles Morales throughout Spider-Man 2 is my favourite aspect of the story without any semblance of a doubt. I think the way they're able to humanise Lee and allow him to grow while inevitably taking responsibility for his past demons, partnered with Miles' journey of overcoming the hatred he feels for Lee, is perfect. This is what I wanted more of in this story. This is what I needed more of in this story, because this character relationship reminds me of what I loved so much about 2018, what I adored about Miles Morales. It's character focused with everything else around it being incidental. This is everything. Miles is the crux of a lot of the positivity I feel towards this game, and as much as I wish he had more, which is exactly why I'm excited about the third game with him taking on the primary Spider-Man role, I don't think the smaller, more intimate moments with Lee, with his family, would have worked nearly as well. Hell, some of the best moments with Peter in this game are with Miles involved, and he's the pivotal crux of the story. His story here honestly reminds me a little of what the first game might have felt like if set in Peter's early days as Spider-Man. Still finding his feet, becoming greater, growing into that Spider-Man he's destined to be someday. A lot of his story does feel as though it meanders, staggering to a point rather than triumphantly swinging as one would expect, but I feel like that's almost the point. Miles is everyone's Spider-Man, and a lot of the content we play as him throughout reflects that same feeling. Little tangent, but I also think it was a great decision to introduce Mysterio as some character for Miles to interact with rather than Peter. These missions, while sometimes a little more frustrating than I should have let them become, told this really interesting side story when pieced together that asked the question of whether or not people are capable of change, and after finishing all of the Mysteriums, there's this neat little moment where Miles and Mysterio talk, a hero to ex-villain, and we see the somewhat naive but beautifully hopeful way in which Miles sees things, believing that Quentin Beck and Mysterio can still be seen as good guys. And that does result in this great line from Beck that resonates so well with what's going on in the story.
So can I tell everyone Mysterio's a good guy now?
Mysterio will always be a villain. Just as Spider-Man will always be a hero. It's when you start looking at the people behind the masks that things get messy.
This line works hand in hand with Miles and the arc he experiences throughout the game. Spider-Man is always facing the responsibility of being the hero to the public, but Miles is forever grappling with this when it comes to his emotions overcoming him when it comes to Martin Lee. He knows justice is the right thing to fight for, and yet he longs to see Lee pay for the personal grievances he caused Miles. This right here in a bottle perfectly encapsulates the struggle that the person under the mask faces when the problem they're fighting to solve is so intrinsically connected to who they truly are. I didn't get to see this cutscene until after I finished the final mission, so this was post-game content for me, but I don't doubt for a second that there is a place that this fits perfectly in the narrative where that line will perfectly resonate with where Miles is at that current point. Without glowingly, I've just spoken about all of that. Everything I mentioned just now with Miles and Mysterio is just a representation of the real aspect of what saved Spider-Man 2 for me. Where I found a lot of disappointment in the main story, and the way that Kraven and Venom are both used compared to what they could have been, I never once felt that in the side content that the game offered, because it's here that Spider-Man can be realised for the character he truly is. What I love about Spider-Man, and what I will always love about Spider-Man, is that he's a hero for the people, the everyday person. There's a reason why one of my all-time favourite Spider-Man moments in film is this scene from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where he stops a small boy being bullied, only for that same boy to later reappear in the film, giving him yet another chance to see the powerful impact he has on the citizens of New York. Or even in Spider-Man 2, where, when unmasked, Peter is told in confidence by every single person on a train carriage that was previously hurtling towards a fatal crash before his intervention, that his identity is safe with them. The most powerful moments a Spider-Man can have come from the people, from the humanity within the man. A flawed and congested story can never destroy that, and that remains true here. No matter how many grievances I might have developed with the main story, I never once had a reason to complain about the vast amounts of small moments you could share with the people who bring life to what Spider-Man truly represents. My favourite moments in this game aren't those big 3-act boss battles with the Lizard or with Venom, it's the little things. It's reconciling with an ex-villain as their attempt to do something better with themselves is hijacked. It's helping someone ask their date to prom, it's swinging with a flock of birds, it's a park bench for God's sake. Those last two moments in particular are two of the more emotionally impactful scenes of the game that had a profound, lasting impact on me as a player as I progressed from those points. Regardless of how I feel towards the story, it's a true testament to the power and the passion that Insomniac has for these characters that I was able to care so deeply upon realising that a homeless man had passed away, and that is completely down to care when it comes to writing the little things. The park bench is this whole other situation, and I mean it with my whole heart when I say that this was the very moment that is the foundation of this video. That moment is the reason you're seeing me talk about this at all. You might remember that I opened this video on a quote, that very quote being from this very mission. I'd be lying if I said I could remember exactly where I was in the story when I first played this, but man, this right here, this moment with Peter being asked if he'd ever known what it felt like to be in love, to have him listen to this old man's story, it's beautiful, man. This is Spider-Man. For me, it always will be. No installment of any Spider-Man media will ever be completely lost on me as long as it can keep true to this, keeping faithful to who he is and what he represents. It never fails to be the smaller, more intimate moments that keep me invested and keep me loving this character, and it's why, as much as I'm disappointed by the overall feeling I had leaving Spider-Man 2 behind, I cherish what is absolutely some of the best Spider-Man content I've ever had the pleasure of witnessing. This game has done one thing much better than anything since the second installment of the Raimi trilogy, and that is remind me of one simple, important thing when it comes to this character. You can take Spider-Man out of the human, but you will never ever take the human out of Spider-Man.
Can I tell you something, Spider-Man? I know I'm fading. It's scary as hell. Thought I'd be ready, but nothing gets you ready. Nothing. When I'm here, it's like she is too. Like I'm living it all over again. All nervous and sweating and whatnot. Then I look into her eyes and it's like I'm home. I was so nervous that day, Spider-Man. Almost didn't even ask. It's like I blinked and she's gone.
I'm sorry.
You said my granddaughter was looking for me? Let's go see her.